I was 40 feet below the surface when the radio crackled. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, surface immediately. It's your family, emergency. I thought it was another drill. But when I saw the look on my commanding officer's face, I knew something was terribly wrong. By the time my boots hit solid ground, I wasn't a Navy SEAL anymore. I was just a father about to lose everything. The words hit like a bullet. Your son didn't make it. Jake. 10 years old. Born with a disability, but stronger than most men I knew. He was my reason to breathe. My wife, Rebecca, said it happened in broad daylight. Our next-door neighbor, Patricia Holloway, the HOA president, had been on their case for months. She hated the ramp I built for Jake's wheelchair. Said it didn't fit the neighborhood look. That day, she came over again, measuring our lawn with that smug little ruler of hers. Jake was outside in his chair, playing with his toy cars. Rebecca was inside, baking cookies. Patricia asked, "Where's your mother, boy?" Jake pointed toward the house, smiling. He didn't speak much, but he didn't need to. Witnesses say Patricia looked furious, like she was insulted by his silence. Rebecca came out when she heard shouting. Words turned into a fight. Patricia pushed. Rebecca pushed back. And then, it happened. One sharp movement. A flash of metal. A sound that still echoes in my skull. By the time Rebecca realized what she'd done, Jake was already gone. That was the moment my world split in two. The house didn't feel like home anymore. There were police markers on the driveway, yellow tape fluttering in the wind where Jake's wheelchair had been. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it lying there, one of the wheels still slowly spinning. Rebecca was sitting in the kitchen, hands shaking, eyes blank. She kept whispering the same words over and over. She didn't mean to. She didn't mean to. But Patricia Holloway had meant it.
The president of our HOA, the self-appointed guardian of suburban perfection, had taken my son's life, and somehow, she still managed to smile for the cameras when the news crews arrived. They called it an accident. She claimed the gun went off when she stumbled. But I'd seen enough combat to know the difference between a stumble and a shot fired with purpose. 2 days later, I wore my uniform to Jake's funeral. His casket was small, too small for any parent to see. The flag folded across it felt heavier than all the missions I'd ever done. My SEAL brothers stood behind me, saluting in silence, but even they couldn't protect me from that moment. I'd faced enemies in deserts, jungles, and oceans, but nothing prepares you for burying your own child. Rebecca barely spoke after that day. I could see the guilt eating her alive. She thought if she'd kept Jake inside, none of it would have happened. I didn't blame her. I blamed her. Patricia. The trial began 3 months later. The courtroom was bright and cold, filled with people who wanted a spectacle. Patricia showed up in a beige suit, hair perfectly curled, her expression soft and sorrowful, like she was the victim. Her lawyer painted a picture of fear. Mrs. Holloway was frightened for her life. The Hayes family had become aggressive. She only wanted to defend herself. Defend herself? From a 10-year-old boy in a wheelchair. They brought up our old HOA disputes, grass length, holiday decorations, the ramp, the noise complaint from when Jake's therapy dog barked at a squirrel. They twisted every detail to make us look unreasonable. And then came the worst blow. The defense pulled out Rebecca's medical records, therapy notes, antidepressant prescriptions. They used her pain, her anxiety, to paint her as unstable. The jury looked at her like she was the one who pulled the trigger. When Rebecca took the stand, she tried to speak, but her voice broke halfway through her sentence. She pointed the gun at me, she whispered. I tried to grab it, then I heard the shot. The defense attorney didn't even let her finish. So you admit there was a struggle? That you touched the weapon? The implication hung heavy in the air. Like maybe Rebecca had caused it. I wanted to shout, to stand up and tell the truth, but my lawyer pressed his hand against my arm, whispering, "Don't. You'll only make it worse. The prosecution did their best. They showed the security footage from a neighbor's doorbell cam. It captured the shouting, a blur of motion, and then the sound. But the frame cut off right before the trigger was pulled. Reasonable doubt. That's all the defense needed. Weeks went by. I sat in that courtroom every single day, watching Patricia's crocodile tears, listening to her lawyer talk about a tragic misunderstanding. When the verdict finally came, the world slowed down. We, the jury, find the defendant, Patricia Holloway, not guilty of first-degree murder. There was a pause. My heart stopped beating. Guilty of voluntary manslaughter. Manslaughter. That word burned in my ears. It meant she didn't mean it. It meant Jake's life was worth a lesser sentence, a smaller punishment, maybe a few years, maybe less. Rebecca gasped. I could hear her crying behind me, quiet and broken. I stood up. I don't even remember doing it, just that my fists were clenched, and I was staring straight at Patricia. For a moment, our eyes met. She wasn't scared. She looked almost relieved. Like she knew the system would always protect her kind. I took one step forward before two SEAL brothers, who'd come to support me, grabbed my arms and pulled me back. One of them whispered, "Don't throw your life away, brother." Not for her. But deep down, I knew, part of me already had. That night, I sat in Jake's room for hours. His toys were still on the shelf, his superhero posters still on the wall. I found one of his cars under the bed, a tiny blue Mustang. I held it so tightly my hand started bleeding from the metal edge. Rebecca came in and sat beside me. She didn't cry anymore. Her eyes were empty, like she'd used up every tear she had. She's going to walk free, she said softly. After everything she's done. I didn't answer. Because I knew if I opened my mouth, the things that would come out wouldn't sound human. That night, while the whole town slept, I made a promise, to Jake, to Rebecca, and to myself. If the system couldn't deliver justice, I would. One way or another. And that's when I started planning. After the verdict, the nights were the worst. Daylight forced me to move through the motions, meetings, lawyers, cameras, but the dark belonged to the plans I tried to bury. I would wake up sweating, map of possibilities in my head like a mission brief. I knew how to make things disappear. I knew how to stage accidents that left no trace. I could think of 100 ways to ensure Patricia Holloway would never hurt another family. Those thoughts did not make me less of a father, they made me more honest with myself. The same training that taught me discipline taught me precision. I imagined each scenario with military clarity, times, locations, witnesses, terrain. The same brain that once calculated how to evacuate a team from a hostile zone now catalogued exit strategies for a civilian life I might ruin. Then I would look at Rebecca, her hollow eyes catching the light of the nursery lamp. She was recovering physically but not emotionally. She would sometimes wake and whisper a name, Jake, then clamp her hand over her mouth as if sound itself might wake him. Our second child, the one we'd named Jake, slept upstairs in a tiny crib. Sometimes I would go into that room and stare at the small chest that held diapers and tiny clothes, and feel the enormity of what choosing violence would take from us. If I walked a path that led to prison, my son would grow up with a father who had once killed to avenge the first. That thought was an arrow through my resolve. So I did what I had always done in the toughest moments, I adapted. I converted rage into strategy, and strategy into purpose. If the courtroom could be twisted by lawyers and charm, then the law itself had to be fixed, not for me alone, but for every parent who could face the same cruelty masked as civic duty. I started small. I spoke with our prosecutor, Jennifer Chin, late one rain-smudged evening. She was tired but sharp, the kind of person who had the patience to sound the alarm and the backbone to follow it. We can win in court, she told me once, but only if the laws that let people like Holloway hide behind HOA bylaws change. Her words landed like a match. We founded the Jake Initiative with a lean team, 3 lawyers, a former journalist, 2 veteran neighbors who had witnessed the harassment, and 12 families who'd been bullied by local boards. We opened a basic website, started collecting testimony, built a file so thick the county clerk joked he needed a forklift to move it. I gave media interviews, each time speaking calmly, with the same voice I used to brief a team before insertion, because fury without direction sounded like a rant, fury that lays out facts sounded like evidence. At the same time, I began meeting with state representatives. The first few sessions felt like banging my head against glass. Some politicians were openly skeptical. Is this a private matter? Why should the state interfere with HOA rules? Others were sympathetic but passive. We'll take a look, they said, and did nothing. That's when I realized legislation is as much about narrative as it is about law. People vote based on stories. We had the story, we needed to get it into every living room. So I learned to speak for more than myself. I told Jake's story without the hot edges of revenge. I showed photos of toy cars, a small blue Mustang, and a superhero poster with a corner folded where Jake had once traced the lines with his finger. I took the podium and, for once, my voice was not a weapon, it was a tool. Reports followed. Editorials ran. A journalist dug through HOA minutes from 3 counties and published a piece on how minor infractions became disproportionate power plays. The momentum built like a storm. I testified in committee hearings with a calm I barely felt. I submitted model legislation that limited HOA enforcement powers, required background checks for board members, mandated transparency in penalties, and created specific protections for families with disabilities. We pushed for mandatory de-escalation training for HOA enforcers and clear paths for mediation before citations could lead to criminal confrontation. Change is not instantaneous. It is a grinding, unromantic process. There were losses, bills died in committee, lobbyists from property interest groups pushed back, one senator who promised support took a large donation and withdrew. But small victories came too. One county passed a measure requiring video evidence for any citation that could lead to fines or eviction. Another introduced mandatory conflict resolution classes for board members. The media spotlight kept turning, and each time it did, another legislator who'd been indifferent became attentive. There were also legal appeals in the background. Patricia Holloway's sentence was reduced on technicalities at one point, and for a moment the old rage flared, sharp, immediate. I called Rebecca that night and expected a broken confession to pour out of her. Instead, she was quiet and firm. "We will not let him die for nothing," she said. "We will not let his name be another footnote." That steadiness kept me anchored. As years passed, the Jake Initiative grew. We created a legal fund to help families fight predatory HOA boards. We pushed for a registry of complaints so patterns could not be erased. We partnered with national disability rights groups and connected with military family networks who understood the cost of institutional failures. The harder work, the day-to-day counseling, the long calls with families who felt abandoned, became the backbone of everything. I traveled to hearings, read testimony into microphones, and sometimes, when the room was empty, I let myself cry in the bathroom sink. The world didn't become fair, but it did bend. 3 states adopted substantial reform influenced by our model. Judges began citing the precedent of HOA overreach in rulings. Municipalities created oversight boards. Patricia Holloway served a sentence that, in the end, did not satisfy the part of me that wanted retribution. She died in custody years later of complications no one celebrated. I did not attend. What I did attend were graduations of young families who'd been helped by the fund, closing ceremonies for playgrounds redesigned to be accessible, and ribbon cutting for legal clinics that offered pro bono counsel to the disabled. These things were small. They were not the violent, cinematic justice that the old story in my head imagined. They were quieter, slower, and far more permanent. On the anniversary of Jake's death, we held a small ceremony. I bent down and placed a little blue Mustang on his grave. Rebecca, stronger now, squeezed my hand. Our son, our second Jake, ran ahead chasing a butterfly, a small laugh trailing behind him like a promise. The grief is still there, it sits with us like an unwelcome guest. But the weight has changed shape. It is no longer purely a furnace of heat and anger. It is a cold, hard thing that we polish into resolve. If you ask me now whether I ever considered taking the other path, I will tell you the truth. I considered it. In the raw days and nights after the verdict, I planned it in clinical detail. But what kept me from walking into that darkness was not morality alone. It was the understanding that one man's vengeance would not bring a child back, it would only multiply the loss. I turned my training, my discipline, and my rage into a campaign that changed systems. It was not the justice I wanted the first night I saw my son fall, but it was the justice that kept my family whole and made it harder for another family to become mine. Jake's story did not end in a courtroom. It became a law, a foundation, a set of protections that made neighborhoods safer for the next child who needs a ramp to come home. That is not a clean victory. It is not the kind of ending in comic books where everything ties up in 30 seconds. It is messy. It is slow. It is human. And for now, that has to be enough.